Alex Fierro writes, the term for people who don't like labels are homosexual.
Ironic.
There's a label for people who don't like labels.
It is a bit ironic.
How to do my Palpatine impression.
Hashtag prequel memes.
More comments. Here's one that is a can of worms. So Mastermind Mentality writes, hi, I am a host of a very serious nonprofit series dedicated to tackling misunderstood online entities under the autism spectrum. Oh boy. So, first of all, very serious nonprofit series, not very specific, so right away I'm a little, I don't know what your intentions are. Let's keep on going though. I stumbled upon this video in my recent research into children who are diagnosed with autism and Asperger who have recently delved into a trend of non-binary / genderqueer culture, as well as many other unique groups like the furry fandom. I have a couple questions concerning this video, if you wouldn't mind answering them. 1. Are you by any chance someone who is on the autism spectrum? If not, do you see any correlation between autism and the non-binary identity? 2. Do you believe that throughout history, all civilizations who have been remembered by being on the backs of men to provide for children and women have never had genderqueer / non-binary terms and entities because of ignorance and lack of advancement with humanity? 3. Do you feel threatened or at all in danger when people question or have concerns regarding the identity behind genderqueer? Specifically, do you feel uncomfortable when people point out the logic of its definition and affiliate it with a psychological condition? Oh boy. So there's a lot here to tackle. And Ignatius, who has been very involved in the comments, and again, thank you for getting involved in these discussions. I think that Ignatius has a lot of interesting things to say. Responded to this and said, this is such ableist, transphobic bullshit. The logic says that it makes perfect sense for us as non-binary people to exist. We have existed in all civilizations throughout history, all over the world, and will always exist no matter how many of us die and are killed. Do some actual research. We are not a trend, we are people. I agree with Ignatius that there's clearly this, and part of why, I mean, I think it was 2 things. First of all, I just felt intimidated by a lot of these questions, because they seem to be coming from a very specific perspective and are kind of leading. And I think that's, in general, when someone claims to be very seriously tackling issues, and they have questions that clearly seem to be leading you in a certain direction and clearly seem to be making certain assumptions from the offset, that raises some red flags. Clearly this person has an assumption going into this that there is a correlation between autism and gender identity, specifically non-binary identities. But also there's clearly other, including the referring to the non-binary genderqueer trend as a trend, it clearly implies a certain perspective that this person is coming from. I am going to address some of these questions. First of all, let me just say as far as I know, I don't have any reason to believe that I'm on the autism spectrum. I've certainly never been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. I'm not someone who's very well informed about autism, so I want to be very careful in how I talk about it, because one of the very few things I really do know about autism is that there is a lot of misinformation that is constantly spread about autism, and it often does a disservice to people who are on the autism spectrum, including the idea that vaccines cause autism, which has been disproven. They do not cause autism. There's a lot of misinformation about autism and a lot of problematic attitudes towards autism that I think do a disservice to people with autism. I'm not an expert. I I know very little about that. But what I will say is there certainly are people who are non-binary and also people who are trans men and trans women who are on the autism spectrum. They certainly exist, and they're totally valid, and it doesn't make them less trans at all, and it doesn't mean that they're following a trend or whatever. In high school, I dated someone who was a trans guy who was on the autism spectrum, or is on the autism spectrum. And I definitely know there are non-binary people, plenty of non-binary people who are on the autism spectrum. I know a trans woman who is on the autism spectrum. So I certainly think there are plenty of people who have autism and or are on the autism spectrum and are also non-binary or trans. But I think I'd be very careful in what assumptions one would make based on that, because I don't know really what the statistics are. I don't know if people with autism or on the autism spectrum are more likely to identify as non-binary or more likely to identify as trans. If they are, that doesn't necessarily say anything about people with autism. I think you have to be careful in making conclusions about people with autism based on that, and you have to be careful about making assumptions about people who are non-binary or who are trans based on that. If this person has actually done any kind of research and has actually come to a conclusion that there is a correlation, which I wouldn't be terribly surprised, maybe there is a correlation. That might just mean that people with autism are more aware of gender, or more aware of how they are outside of gender norms, and are more likely to discover that they are genderqueer, or that they're non-binary, or that they're transgender, perhaps. And I want to be careful. I don't want to assume the worst about this person. Maybe they have good intentions. But I do think there are tendencies for people to invalidate the behaviors and identities and ideas of people with autism. And I don't think that's a good trend. I would love to hear from, if you are on the autism spectrum, and particularly if you are non-binary, if you are trans, I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
While editing this video, I did some research and discovered that there have been several studies that have found a correlation between the autism spectrum and gender variance. While experts differ on their hypotheses for why this link occurs, many have suggested that this may result from those on the autism spectrum having less susceptibility to societal expectations about gender. In other words, perhaps this correlation does not result from transgender people being more likely to be autistic, or people on the autism spectrum being more likely to be transgender, but instead people on the autism spectrum being more likely to come out as transgender because they feel less constrained by social norms. I have included links to some of these studies and some other resources regarding this topic in the description. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this issue, particularly if you are a non-binary and/or transgender person on the autism spectrum. And to any non-binary and/or transgender people on the autism spectrum watching this video, know that I support you. Don't let anyone invalidate your gender identity because you are on the autism spectrum.
To address the second question, do you believe that throughout all history, To be quite honest, I'm not like a historical or anthropological expert. I do know that non-binary identities have existed in many different cultures, or I guess it's, you have to be careful to what degree you label them as non-binary, because, that kind of invalidates the way that a lot of historical cultures have labeled them, and there's different ways that, but certainly people who have either identified with a gender that is not their assigned gender at birth have existed. People who have had identified as like third gender, or a gender that is not male or female, have existed for a long time. I would want to know more specifics until I delved into it a little bit more deeply. That might be a good idea for a future video. I'd have to do more research on that. I'd want to be hesitant in terms of just labeling, going like, oh, well, that society had this perception of gender, they are, inferior. They're less advanced. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and that's a bit of an oversimplification. I'd be hesitant in really responding to that question. Do I feel threatened and in danger when I have questions or concerns regarding the identity? Not really, no. I mean, I feel threatened when people make assumptions, like make false assumptions based on me, assume that I have bad intentions in identifying as genderqueer. I feel threatened if people seem to indicate some sort of fear around it. If people feel threatened by it, then I can sense that sometimes, and I'm like, uh-oh, is this person going to be hostile towards me? If people have a different idea or have different, ways of understanding, I think my past responses in this video would indicate that no, I don't find it threatening when people have questions about it. Not really. I think when I don't necessarily know people's intentions, and when someone is like this and seem to already have certain assumptions that they're making or certain theories about it, then I get a little bit cautious because I don't want to I don't want people to be I don't want to be spreading false information inadvertently or helping others spread potentially false information inadvertently. Particularly, and again, like, because this person brought up the autism spectrum, again, not an expert on it. As far as I know, I am not autistic, not on the autism spectrum, have no reason to believe that I am on the autism spectrum, and I certainly do not want to speak for autistic people. Certainly do not want to make assumptions about people with autism. I think that's very dangerous, and again, there's already way too much false information being spread about autism. I don't want to contribute to that. Alex Fierro writes on my a video I made on feminism, probably one of my more controversial videos. I'm not a feminist. I believe in gender equality. As a trans person, I see two transphobic holes in the feminist movement. The main hole is that feminism completely ignored the non-binary community by saying they want men and women to have equal rights. The second hole I see is that feminists are very transphobic, especially when it comes to trans women. I also believe that the feminist movement is hateful towards men, but not in the way you think. Men get discrimination, obviously not as much as women, about their gender roles, male rape, and men who are people of color. I think when feminists do this, they blind the male rights movement of the discrimination they face and make members of the male rights movement completely focused on discriminating the feminist movement. I think there's definitely some valid stuff here. Yes, I would argue there are definitely feminists who are transphobic, particularly towards trans women. That is undeniable. There are feminists, again, the people who we call are frequently referred to as TERFs, which stands for transgender exclusionary radical feminists. Transphobic feminists, or transgender critical feminists, I think is a term I like to do. I don't really like to beat around the bush like that and use a cute term to refer to them. There definitely are transphobic feminists, and particularly trans-misogynistic feminists are unfortunately not uncommon. I totally understand why a lot of transgender people are very hesitant to identify with this movement when that's just an unfortunate reality. And I also agree kind of with the idea of, the term feminist, one could have a similar interpretation of it kind of enforcing the gender binary in a way. But I try to have a bit of a reparative attitude towards feminism and understand that while it's not perfect, and while its history is not perfect, and while there are plenty of feminists who are bigots and who do not reflect the needs of all women and maybe disregard non-binary people, I think there's a way of understanding. I think there are plenty of feminists and people who call themselves feminists who do acknowledge non-binary people, who are very inclusive of trans women, who are very inclusive of all transgender people, and who understand that men, there are ways that the patriarchy, or whatever you want to call it, or just systemic sexism, hurts men too. I think that there is truth to men having certain disadvantages too. Again, not as much as women. I think the tricky thing is, I would say maybe there's some exceptions, but it does seem like the men's rights movement has, if it's ever had good intentions, it seems like it's far too dominated by men who just want to totally disregard any points that any feminists bring up, and just want to just go like, oh, well, that's not true, wage gap, that's just bullshit, or this, it seems like oftentimes people who call themselves men's rights activists aren't really concerned about actual serious issues that men face. They seem more concerned with exposing cringy feminists, and it's like, anyways, yeah, I do agree with a lot of this person's points. Feminism is far from perfect. I understand if a lot of people have a hesitance to identify with feminism because of that, but I think that our understanding of feminism is evolving, and I think that it is becoming more inclusive of transgender people. And I think that a lot of feminists do acknowledge non-binary identities. Some of them maybe don't, and some of them, there definitely are transphobic feminists out there. Don't get me wrong. That's definitely, and particularly trans-misogynistic feminists. And I hope that changes. But I think that it's still worth acknowledging how women historically and to this day are marginalized. You need to have an intersectional approach to feminism, and not just be like, oh, it's just women are all oppressed equally. No, there's different women face different kinds of oppression. You need to acknowledge how people of women of color face certain issues. Trans women face certain issues. Trans women of color face certain issues. Specifically, Black women and Black women of color, have particular needs, and you can't treat it like. And that's been what's criticized as like white feminism. So I mean, it's never and there's all sorts of feminism. Sometimes someone can claim a feminist perspective, but sometimes their perspective is limited by their own privilege. The point is, yes, feminism as a whole is not perfect. But that doesn't mean that it's not valid. This is from a user by the name Mandy Owen. Someone called me a cisgender today, and I've never really heard the term before. The person has never met me. They simply commented on a post I made, and it sort of seemed rather rude, actually. It was just the way they brought it up. I get really tired of being told I'm this or that. I've never felt the need to change anything about me, but the bullying I had as a child just made me despise labeling as a whole. I get so tired of people trying to define me as a person. So I'm not transgender. It doesn't mean I hate on their life choices. It's their life, and they should define who they are. I never really even cared for genders. I just knew I liked certain types of people, and I was totally for being on their side, but now I'm just scared of it. The transgender people I've seen aren't nice. They're extremely rude. I have even met someone who prefers not to be male or female, and I admire them quite a bit. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm just a tomboy. I like my female body. I just don't like the clothes and makeup women generally like to wear. This also makes me apparently look like a lesbian now. I miss just being a tomboy. Now I'm afraid of being seen as something I don't want to be seen as. I think this does touch on something important, which is, I don't think that we should use the term cisgender to just dismiss a perspective entirely. Because the fact is, just because someone is cisgender doesn't mean that they don't have their own struggles with gender. They don't have their own struggles with dealing with gender expectations and gender roles. So yeah, this does, I don't know. I mean, and again, with all these comments, this is, I'm trusting that this person is being honest, and isn't leaving out important, significant information. But, judging based on this person is describing their experience, it seems like sometime maybe there was a misunderstanding that had to do with the particular terminology or whatnot that this person was using, that maybe this person that another person, a transgender person, objected to, or whatever. And I think that's a tricky thing. I think when you just dismiss someone like, oh, you're just cisgender, and you have a limited perspective because of that, what's tricky is, first of all, you don't know that maybe this person is actually a trans person who's figuring out their identity, and just isn't presenting it. You wouldn't know that they're trans, or they haven't come out as trans yet, but they're struggling with that. Or they're just someone who maybe they're cis, but they've had their own particular struggle with, they, like this person, they say that they understood themselves as a tomboy when they were younger, but now that's, and people are labeling that as something else now. I don't think that most trans people are like this. First of all, things can quickly get nasty online because I think it's easy to assume the worst about a person. I'm certainly not perfect with this either. I've had my fair share of times when I've seen a comment or I've seen a tweet or whatever, and I'm like, oh, this person is a real piece of shit. Fuck them. And I'm going to write something really mean about them in response. It's easy to get caught up in that, for sure. But I think we do have to be careful about when we're assuming the worst about a person. Because one tweet, one Facebook status, one YouTube comment doesn't reflect a person's entire experience. I do think a lot of times why transgender people sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes we might be a little quick to try to dismiss someone is that I think it is sometimes a defense mechanism. I think sometimes we're so used to people rejecting us. We're so used to people trying to invalidate our identities, trying to dismiss our experience, that I think sometimes some trans people can get very defensive very quickly. And it does come from a valid place. Most of us live in societies where we are assumed to be outside of the norm, and we're treated like we're outside of the norm. So I think sometimes it is a little natural to be cautious and be a little quick to assume that someone has transphobic intentions. But I do think we have to be careful about that, because again, and there's also cases where, like, who knows? I don't know this person, but I mean, who knows what they're, either it sounds like, who knows? Maybe they have questions about their gender identity. I don't know. Or maybe they are just someone who doesn't totally fit into the role of, like what society's expectations of what a feminine girl should be. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're trans, but they have a specific experience that is valid and that isn't, I think we shouldn't just dismiss. And I don't know, that's a thing that I think people should be careful about. And it's tricky, and I don't think we should assume, and it's something particularly when someone, just because someone is cisgender or someone presents as cisgender, doesn't mean that they're totally comfortable with the gender that they're assigned at birth. Try to have compassion, try to have patience with one another is all I'd say. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it definitely sucks if you're just dismissed, like, oh, you're cisgender, you don't get it. I get how that could suck, especially, again, if you've had this your own specific relationship with gender that isn't just, so simple, as, oh, I'm a girl and I'm totally comfortable being a girl and I'm totally comfortable with whatever society's expectations of being a girl are. And it's not even from a perspective of like, oh no, this is an instance of cisphobia. I don't buy into that. I don't believe in that idea. But it is a case where potentially we are, by dismissing someone as cisgender, we're potentially hurting someone who either who has their own struggle with gender potentially. Something to think about. Similarly, Animation Team 1 says even cis people struggle. In order to find inner balance, it used to be called getting in touch with your feminine side for men. It's much more money now. Many people speak like being cis is a terrible thing, and it makes you a terrible soulless person. You can be a cisgender person. You can be like, for the most part, I'm comfortable identifying as a man. I see myself as a man. But on the other side, like I don't want to perform hyper masculinity, and I don't like a lot of what society and what the media is telling me what it means to be a man or what it means to be masculine. That's not who I am. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
The next and final comment, and my response to it, deals with suicide and self-harm. If you feel uncomfortable with this topic, or if this topic may trigger you, I recommend that you stop watching the video now. Thank you for watching. I have one more part of this first episode of Ask Ariel that I hope to have out in a day or two.
P-Proach writes on my video about suicide. I had to sit down with a teacher after class because he made a casual remark about suicide. I ended up crying a bit because I had been shaking with anger for the rest of the lesson and my energy had to go somewhere. I don't care as long as he doesn't say anything like that again, but I realized if anyone was freaked out by what he said during class, they didn't get to hear me tell him off. If that ever happens again with anyone else, I'll be sure to jump out of my seat and lecture the person loudly enough for the whole group to hear. Bahahaha. That's something that's always kind of shocked me. I feel like suicide is frequently used as on shows and in movies, sometimes even in comedy, a lot of times it's used as kind of a casual punchline. That's always kind of made me uncomfortable. I think I've kind of accepted it more. Sometimes, especially when I'm kind of in a very morbid place or not necessarily suicidal, but when I'm feeling very self-destructive, I kind of do enjoy some morbid comedy about suicide. But yeah, I do think there is a strange trend a lot of time. For a lot of people, they think that suicide or even self-harm is something that can just be casually brought up and there be no consequences, which is not true. I mean, because you don't know what people in a room are dealing with, and they could be dealing with suicidal thoughts. They could know someone who deals with suicidal thoughts. They could deal with self-harm, and that can be really shitty for someone to have to deal with when it just comes up randomly. There's definitely a lot of times when I notice when someone will be like, casually be like, oh, I just want to fucking kill myself, or oh, why don't you go fucking kill yourself? And they don't mean it genuinely. They don't genuinely mean I'm gonna actually go kill. They don't actually mean that they're gonna go kill themselves, and they don't actually think someone should go kill themselves. It's just a hyperbolic statement. But or I'm gonna go cut myself or something like that. I think for one, it makes it difficult. Sometimes it makes it difficult to know when someone's really serious, because sometimes someone will say something kind of jokingly, sort of, but it could actually reflect some truth. It could actually reflect a genuine self-destructive urge, to differing degrees, and that's a tricky thing. But yeah, no, I agree. And just in general, that's a trend that should stop, and especially not in school. Shouldn't make a casual remark about suicide like that. I mean, I guess it depends if it's relevant to a discussion. I mean, that's a little bit different if you're talking about suicide rates or whatever. But if you're making a casual joke about suicide in the context of a class, I don't know. I don't think that really adds to anything.